August 5, 1962. Brentwood, Los Angeles. Before the sun rose, before the city woke up, Marilyn Monroe was already dead. She was found naked in her bed, the bedroom door locked, the lights still on, an empty pill bottle nearby. She was 36 years old. The official conclusion would later read probable suicide. But from the very first hours, nothing about that night made sense. The timeline was broken. The witnesses contradicted each other. Critical evidence disappeared. And Marilyn Monroe's death immediately became something far darker than a Hollywood tragedy. Marilyn Monroe was not just a movie star. She was the most recognizable woman on the planet, a global symbol of desire, beauty, and fantasy. Millions wanted her. Almost no one truly knew her. When the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds disappeared, Marilyn vanished too. What remained was Norma Jean, a woman shaped by abandonment, trauma, and an endless search for love. And on the night she died, that fragile boundary between image and reality finally collapsed. But the most disturbing question was not how she died. It was who might have been there when it happened. The public narrative was simple and convenient: a depressed actress, career falling apart, drug addiction, overdose, end of story. Yet simple stories often exist to protect complex truths, because in this case the police were not called immediately. Hours passed before authorities were notified. The body showed signs that did not align with the official explanation, and several key details from that night were never properly documented. This was the moment Marilyn Monroe's story crossed from celebrity biography into political mystery. Just weeks before her death, Marilyn had stood on stage in front of thousands at Madison Square Garden, singing to the President of the United States. The performance was intimate, controversial, and unforgettable. It blurred the line between Hollywood and power. After that night, her world changed rapidly. Phone calls stopped being returned. Invitations disappeared. Powerful people distanced themselves. Once again, Marilyn was discarded when she became inconvenient. And yet, that was only the beginning of the danger. On Saturday, August 4, 1962, Marilyn Monroe spent the day at her Brentwood home. According to official accounts, she appeared tired but calm. Her psychiatrist visited earlier in the day. Nothing alarming was reported. On paper, it was an ordinary afternoon, but history shows that the most catastrophic events often begin on ordinary days. As the evening approached, something shifted. Marilyn's phone conversations became strange. Her voice sounded slowed, disoriented. Her words lacked clarity. This was not entirely unusual for someone battling insomnia and medication dependency. What made this night different was what happened afterward, or more accurately, what was never fully recorded. As night fell, the house grew quiet. The bedroom light remained on. The door was locked from the inside. No sound came from within. Hours passed in silence, and still no authorities were contacted. That silence would become one of the most troubling elements of the case. Sometime after midnight, concern turned into alarm. Marilyn was unresponsive. The bedroom door remained locked. The light was still on. When the door was finally forced open, Marilyn was found lifeless in her bed. Rigor mortis had already begun. Medical experts would later suggest she had been dead for hours. And yet, the police were not notified until much later. This delay would never be convincingly explained. When law enforcement finally arrived, the scene had already been disturbed. Doctors had entered the room. Objects had been moved. Potential evidence was compromised. The narrative of suicide was quickly established, even before a full investigation had taken place. But one detail refused to disappear. Despite the claim of a massive oral overdose, Marilyn Monroe's stomach contained no pill residue. No capsules, no fragments, nothing. This alone should have raised immediate red flags. Instead, it was quietly dismissed. And then there were the bruises. Subtle discolorations in areas inconsistent with oral ingestion suggested a different method of drug administration, one rarely discussed publicly, one that would not leave traces in the stomach. At this point, the story stopped being about an actress who took too many pills. It became about what Marilyn Monroe knew, who she knew, and why her silence mattered. In the hours after her death, personal items vanished. Phone records disappeared. Most notably, a small red diary she was known to keep was never found. According to those close to her, it contained sensitive information about powerful figures, private meetings, and secrets never meant to become public. That diary has never resurfaced. And as investigators closed the case, questions only multiplied. Why were phone logs missing? Why did witnesses change their statements? Why was the timeline altered? And why were federal agencies quietly monitoring Marilyn Monroe in the months before her death? Because Marilyn was not just a movie star anymore. She had become a liability. And next, the story turns to the men whose names were never meant to be spoken out loud, and the final 24 hours that may have sealed her fate. The final 24 hours of Marilyn Monroe's life remain one of the most disputed timelines in modern American history. What appears on paper as a simple sequence of events collapses under closer examination. Times do not align. Witnesses disagree. Medical evidence contradicts official conclusions. And the most critical hours, the window in which Marilyn likely died, remain disturbingly unclear. Saturday, August 4, 1962 began quietly. Marilyn stayed at her Brentwood home, a modest Spanish-style house hidden behind tall hedges. She had recently been fired from her latest film project, her reputation labeled as unreliable by the studio system she had helped enrich. Financial stress, emotional exhaustion, and physical dependency on medication had converged, yet those close to her would later insist that she was not suicidal that day. She was anxious, unsettled, but also planning ahead. Appointments were scheduled, future meetings discussed. These details matter because suicidal intent rarely coexists with future-oriented behavior. Early that afternoon, her psychiatrist visited. According to later statements, Marilyn appeared fragile but stable. No emergency measures were taken. No immediate danger was reported. This visit would later become crucial because it placed a medical authority at the scene just hours before her death, someone whose testimony would shape the official narrative. As the day moved toward evening, Marilyn remained alone. Her housekeeper noticed nothing unusual beyond the familiar signs of fatigue and medication use. This was not an exceptional state for Marilyn in 1962. What made the night different was not her condition, but the response or lack of response when that condition escalated. As evening turned into night, Marilyn made several phone calls. The content of those calls would later be described as confusing, emotionally charged, and unsettling. Her speech reportedly sounded slowed and disconnected. These descriptions would later be used to support the overdose narrative, but they also raise a critical question. If those around her recognized she was impaired, why was no immediate help summoned? Here is where the timeline begins to fracture. At approximately 10:00 p.m., Marilyn retreated to her bedroom. The door was locked. The light remained on. From that point forward, no one saw her alive again, at least according to official accounts. But medical evidence would later suggest that death had already occurred or was imminent within the next hour or two. And yet no authorities were contacted. Instead, time passed, the house remained quiet, the light under the bedroom door stayed on, midnight came and went, the silence stretched on. When concern finally escalated into action, the response was not to call the police. A doctor was contacted first. This decision would haunt the case forever. By the time the bedroom door was forced open, Marilyn Monroe was clearly dead. Her body was cool to the touch. Rigor mortis had begun setting in. These physical signs are medically significant because they indicate death had occurred hours earlier. Not minutes, not recently, hours. Despite this, law enforcement was not notified immediately. An additional delay of roughly 2.5 to 3 hours occurred before police were finally called to the scene. No official explanation for this delay has ever fully satisfied investigators or independent researchers. This missing time is the heart of the mystery. Those lost hours represent an unaccounted window in which the scene could be altered, evidence removed, and narratives shaped. When police eventually arrived, they did not encounter a preserved death scene. They entered a space that had already been accessed, disturbed, and partially sanitized. The official cause of death was listed as acute barbiturate poisoning. The conclusion stated that Marilyn had consumed a lethal quantity of nembutal and chloral hydrate. The problem was that her body did not support this claim. During the autopsy, doctors found no trace of pill residue in her stomach. No fragments, no capsules, no powder. This is medically inconsistent with a massive oral overdose. In such cases, at least some residue is almost always present. The absence of it raised immediate internal concerns, but those concerns were not emphasized publicly. Even more troubling were the findings in her lower digestive tract. Subtle bruising and discoloration suggested drug absorption through an alternative route, one that bypasses the stomach entirely. This method would explain the lack of pill residue while still allowing lethal levels of medication to enter the bloodstream rapidly. This possibility was never thoroughly investigated. At this point, the case should have been reopened. Instead, it was quietly closed. But the unanswered questions did not stop there. In the days following Marilyn's death, it became clear that several personal items were missing from her home. Most notably, a small red diary she was known to keep. According to multiple sources, Marilyn used this diary to record private thoughts, meetings, and sensitive information. Some claimed it contained details about political figures, confidential conversations, and matters far beyond the world of entertainment. That diary was reportedly present in her home shortly before her death. It was never recovered. Equally troubling was the disappearance of her phone records. Calls made and received during her final hours were never fully documented. Requests to access those records were denied or returned incomplete. In an era before digital data redundancy, physical records could be removed, and they were. Adding to the unease, it later emerged that Marilyn Monroe had been under federal surveillance. Declassified documents would reveal that intelligence agencies had monitored her associations, particularly due to her relationships with politically sensitive individuals and her marriage to a controversial writer. She was viewed not as a citizen in distress, but as a potential risk. A risk that knew too much. Witness statements only deepened the confusion. Accounts of who was present, who arrived when, and who made critical decisions changed over time. Some testimonies were revised multiple times, others contradicted physical evidence. The consistency expected in a suicide investigation simply did not exist. And yet the official conclusion remained untouched. Probable suicide. No criminal charges, no grand jury, no reopened inquiry. As years passed, independent investigators, journalists, and historians continued to uncover inconsistencies. Each discovery pointed to the same conclusion. Marilyn Monroe's death was handled with unusual haste, minimal scrutiny, and remarkable deference to powerful interests. Because this was not just the death of a movie star. It was the death of a woman entangled with the most powerful men in America. And next, the story moves beyond timelines and medical reports, into the web of political power, forbidden relationships, and secrets that may have sealed Marilyn Monroe's fate long before August 5, 1962. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was no longer just a Hollywood actress. She had become entangled in a world where glamour intersected with political power, national security, and reputational risk. Her relationships extended far beyond movie studios and celebrity circles. They reached into the highest levels of American government, and that reality fundamentally changed the way her death must be examined. Marilyn's association with President John F. Kennedy was never officially acknowledged, yet it was widely understood within elite circles. Their connection was discreet, carefully managed, and ultimately deemed dangerous. What began as fascination evolved into liability. Marilyn was emotionally vulnerable, deeply attached, and increasingly unpredictable. For a presidency built on image control and Cold War tension, unpredictability was unacceptable. As pressure mounted, Marilyn found herself slowly pushed aside. Communication cooled, access vanished. She was excluded without explanation. For someone whose deepest trauma stemmed from abandonment, this rejection was devastating, but it also made her volatile. Those close to her later described a woman oscillating between despair and determination. She was not simply collapsing, she was talking, she was remembering, and she was writing things down. This is where the narrative becomes truly unsettling. Multiple sources have claimed that Marilyn Monroe kept detailed personal notes about her interactions with powerful figures. These notes allegedly included names, locations, private conversations, and references to matters far beyond personal affairs. Allegations ranged from political strategies to foreign policy discussions, including sensitive topics tied to Cold War tensions. Whether all of these claims were accurate remains uncertain. What is certain is that several people believed Marilyn possessed information that could cause serious damage if made public. That belief alone was enough to make her dangerous. As John F. Kennedy distanced himself, attention shifted to his younger brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Officially, no relationship existed. Unofficially, rumors intensified. What mattered most was not romance but proximity. Robert Kennedy was deeply involved in national security matters, intelligence coordination, and aggressive campaigns against organized crime. His presence in Marilyn's orbit raised alarms among those tasked with protecting the administration. On August 4, 1962, Robert Kennedy was in California. This fact is no longer disputed. What remains disputed is where he went and whom he saw. Witnesses later claimed to have seen him near Marilyn's home that day. Official statements denied this. Timelines were adjusted. Travel records were questioned. The truth was never conclusively established. But the implications were enormous. If Marilyn had confronted powerful individuals that day, if she had threatened to expose secrets, or if she had simply refused to remain silent, the situation would have escalated rapidly. In a climate defined by paranoia, espionage fears, and political survival, extreme measures were not unthinkable. At this point, several competing explanations for Marilyn Monroe's death emerge. The first is deliberate murder. In this scenario, Marilyn was silenced because she posed a threat. Her death was staged to resemble suicide. Evidence was removed. The delay in contacting police allowed time to control the narrative. The missing diary, altered timelines, and compromised autopsy all support this theory. Its weakness lies in its scale. Such an operation would have required coordination, secrecy, and long-term silence from multiple parties. The second theory is a covert government intervention. Under this explanation, Marilyn's death was not personal retaliation, but damage control. She was viewed as a national security risk. Surveillance records suggest she was monitored. If intervention occurred, it may have been intended as containment rather than execution. A fatal outcome would then require immediate concealment to avoid scandal. This theory explains federal interest but relies heavily on circumstantial evidence. The third possibility is accidental overdose followed by a cover-up. Marilyn was known to consume large quantities of medication. Mixing sedatives was common. An accidental overdose is medically plausible. However, if politically sensitive individuals were present or involved shortly before her death, the incident could not be allowed to unfold naturally. The scene would have been altered not to hide murder, but to hide association. This theory accounts for the medical contradictions, while explaining the urgency to control information. The fourth explanation remains the official one: suicide. Marilyn was depressed, her career was faltering. She struggled with addiction. She had a history of emotional instability. All of this is true, but suicide does not explain the missing evidence, the altered timeline, the delayed police response, or the federal surveillance. It explains her pain, but not the procedural failures that followed her death. No single theory answers every question, but together they form a pattern. That pattern suggests one undeniable truth: Marilyn Monroe's death was not handled like an ordinary suicide. Key evidence was lost, critical procedures were bypassed, influential figures were shielded from scrutiny, and the case was closed with remarkable speed. As decades passed, documents were declassified, witnesses spoke more freely, historians revisited the evidence. Each new revelation reinforced the same conclusion: something went wrong on the night of August 4, 1962, and the truth was never fully told. Marilyn Monroe became frozen in time as an icon. Her image remained youthful, radiant, untouchable, but the woman behind that image was erased the moment her story became inconvenient. Her voice was lost, her notes disappeared, her final hours were rewritten. Perhaps the most tragic element is that Marilyn Monroe did not need to be powerful to be dangerous. She only needed to be honest. In a world built on secrecy, honesty can be fatal. 60 years later, her death still refuses to rest. It resurfaces in documentaries, investigations, and unanswered questions. Each generation returns to the same moment, hoping clarity will finally emerge, but clarity was never the goal. Silence was. Marilyn Monroe did not simply die on August 5, 1962. She became part of a larger story about power, control, and the cost of knowing too much. Whether she was murdered, silenced indirectly, or lost to a system that failed her, one truth remains unchanged. The official story is incomplete. And until every missing hour, every vanished document, and every contradiction is fully explained, the question will remain: what really happened to Marilyn Monroe?